we're doing these talks as to give some profile to Canadians who are at the front line, but who have links with the UK of what's currently happening to us all. So the COVID pandemic. And you have a particular story to tell. So I wanted to hear from you about your participation in the vaccine trials in Oxford.
Yeah, so I guess honestly, I saw the advertisement on Twitter that they needed participants. And I was feeling incredibly useless, like I think a lot of people are, but it really puts into perspective kind of what you can do to help when there are people dying around the world. And so it felt like a very tangible thing that I could do to help. So I decided to sign up. And yeah, since then have been going through screening appointment, vaccination appointment, taking my diagnostics every day, just trying to be a good test participant.
Fantastic. I think really interesting what you said about, feeling useless or helpless. In my job, I've got colleagues who are far more on the front line of this than I am, in countries where they've had thousands of British citizens stranded and all that stuff. So I share your feeling sometimes of wanting to do a little more, and it's brilliant that you have this opportunity. So what's it like to be involved in something which is potentially, this could potentially change the world. Let's not underestimate what you're doing.
Yeah, that's very kind. I don't necessarily feel like my participation is the greatest part. I don't know if there would have been many other people who would have been willing to do this in Oxford. But yeah, it's very cool to think that I could have an effective vaccine in me right now. And it's very cool to think that this is how history is made, basically, by people testing it out and seeing what happens when we go out into the community. And so, yeah, it makes me look at the world a little bit differently, and it's nice.
So, and you don't know, do you, whether you've got the vaccine or whether you've got a placebo? That's right.
Yeah, and it's an active placebo, so it's either a vaccine for meningitis and sepsis or to fight against COVID-19, and one of the two, if it works, the one of the two would be a lot more prized right now.
Sure. And there's you talk about it as if you've just done it, sort of as a good thing to do, and it's a great thing to do. There is a personal risk involved for you, isn't there? Because if it is a placebo.
Yeah, I guess with every vaccine, there's a risk of the allergic reaction to it. But then also in this case, because things kind of timelines had to be tightened, there's the risk that this will actually cause an increased reaction if exposed to COVID-19. So that happened with a few of the experimental SARS vaccines that on animals that actually increased the negative response that they had to it and caused increased inflammation of the lungs compared to ones that didn't receive the vaccine. So yeah, there is a risk. I guess you just need to weigh that. I chose to weigh that against how important this is. And it really seems like finding a vaccine is the thing right now. And so really, if I am young and healthy enough to take on that risk, it seems like I definitely should. And also I just hope that the scientists are right when they say that the risk in this case is very low for various reasons.
So what have they actually told you to do in terms of, you're now, not quite out and about having normal life, because although there's been some easing of the restrictions in the UK, there are still quite a lot of restrictions in place. What have they told you to do when you're out and about in the street or in the supermarket?
Yeah, so everyone asks me that. Everyone asks if I'm supposed to go out and try to get infected or do risky behavior. But no, so they're not allowed to intentionally infect us. And they say to not assume that you are immune. So I think I'm a pretty highly cautious person in general. I am still going to the grocery store very sparingly. Even though restrictions have opened up in the UK and we're allowed to go out for exercise more often, I don't go out during the daytime because there are lots of people around. And I, am in general just trying to avoid it. And I hope that doesn't mean, for us to know if this is effective, there do need to be some people from the placebo group who get infected. So I hope that doesn't mean I'm stalling the results, but at the same time, I think I'm being responsible about it. And either way, part of the trial is just seeing how humans react to getting the vaccine. So
Sure.
I can always provide that.
And do you know other people? Have you been in touch with other people who are involved, or are you all doing it completely independently?
So there might be other people who I know who haven't mentioned that they're doing it, but I do know one other person from Australia who also signed up for this, and it was exactly the same thing, that she wanted to do something tangible to make a difference. And who knows, maybe we're already immune to it.
This is, you're based in Oxford, which is where this is taking place. So what's it like being part of a team? You know, you're part of a team now at one of the best universities in the world, which is really leading the research in this. How's the interaction with the team been?
Yeah, it is really interesting. I mean, even when I'm getting my blood work done, I'm just talking to medical students who basically signed up to be extras in this research project, and they're the ones taking my blood work, and they just are really knowledgeable and really enthusiastic about it as well. It seems like a lot of people in Oxford, even if they weren't researchers, joined the team to kind of do as much as they could, and yeah, it's interesting.
So do you have in mind a scenario, a film script, a book that you're going to write about all this later? Because I mean, it strikes me that this is it's a really fertile time for creative people, which you are. Do you have that in the back of your mind for later on?
Yeah, so probably not a book. I'm sure there are enough people doing that, but I've been filming video diaries about my daily kind of thoughts about this and the different things that I have to do. And hopefully we'll be putting that together in a video project.
Fantastic. And what is the timescale that they have, that the team have given to you about, you know, what are the next stages in this project?
Yeah, at the end of May, I go back for my next appointment where they're going to take some blood work. And then I basically keep just reporting my symptoms in an e-diary every evening for at least the next 6 months, they say, although
wow.
who knows if it will contract if we know the results sooner, and then possibly a year. And then I think after that, even if they don't know the results, my participation is probably done and they'll have to move on to some new participants.
And so, you know, one of the reasons that we're talking to you now, apart from the fact it's really interesting to hear what you've been doing, is because we're hosting this global vaccine summit on the 4th of June. And so it's from a sort of international perspective, how do you see the international picture here? What do you think is important in terms of the international community's response?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Have some questions on that myself.
It's very, very nice to be able to ask a journalist the questions for once.
Yeah, very weird to be answering them for once. I mean, so the question, I think, is going to be, how can we ensure equitable access? Mm-hmm. It could be very easy for the richest countries to kind of dominate the vaccine market and be immune before everyone else. And so that's something that I will definitely be watching really carefully, is how different governments are talking about what they can do and how the collaboration happens. Yeah.
Can I ask you, so you know, you're not or you are at home, you're in your sort of current home, but you're not at home.
Right.
How does it feel to be in the UK at the moment for you? I mean, you know, I'm in the opposite situation for you. I'm here. Most of my family is back in the UK.
Right. Yeah.
How does it feel?
Yeah. So in some ways, people asked my husband and I if we ever intended to fly back before all this happened. And to that, the answer is no. I mean, we feel very confident about the UK healthcare system, and we have a comfortable life here. But at the same time, I don't know when the next time is that I will see my family. Yeah. We intended to fly back this summer, and that obviously is not happening. We have another plan in December if that works out, and again, that might not happen. And so it's kind of, I guess, more reason that we really want this vaccine to work, because it just feels a little weird to not even have the option to see my family.
Yeah, I'm in exactly the same position. I saw my parents the beginning of December last year. I haven't seen them since, and I think I could go a whole calendar year without seeing them. And my kids are in the UK as well, so it's really tough. And I think you're right. I mean, you know, for every big question we're asking ourselves, for most of us, there are immediate personal implications, which are really tough. And we've never had to deal with that sort of thing before. You know, I didn't see my parents that often, but at least I knew if I needed to, I could get on a plane and
Exactly.
So it's now time to reverse the roles, and you can ask me really difficult questions.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. So my first question is, it's already been announced that if the Oxford vaccine proves successful, the UK will gain first access. First for 30 million doses by September, if that's possible, and an eventual 100 million in total. My question is, after the production of those 100 million doses given to the UK, how much authority at that point does the UK government have over where the Oxford vaccine is distributed and how it's priced?
I think that is, as you said earlier, I think that is the most important question now. I think that there are two key elements to it. First of all is the price, and I think that Oxford and AstraZeneca have been very clear that they do not want there to be a bidding war. This is about cooperation. It's not about competition. You know, the work that we've done with the Global Vaccines Alliance and with Gavi and with CEPI is all orientated towards equitable access. Because, I mean, first of all, because that's the right thing to do. And I think actually this pandemic gives us the opportunity to think very carefully about how we want to manage the next epidemic, the next pandemic, the access to vaccines in the future. Gavi has already done fantastic work, saved millions and millions of lives. But I think there is now the scope to make that even more sort of solidified, the rules by which, or the guidelines under which that operates. And the second thing I think is the money. And you know, it would be absolutely appalling if the people with the most money were able to buy into this. And the final thing I'd say is that it's in our interest to make sure that as many people are vaccinated as possible. So apart from doing the right thing, there's an important element here of what it means for us if other countries don't have the same access as we do, because you know, you can't just treat this, as we've seen, you can't just treat it in isolation. Everybody needs to be doing the same things at the same time, or at least in ways. So I think that's you know, if you take it to the sort of purely self-interested point, we all have an interest in making sure that as many people as possible are vaccinated.
So will the UK government have a legal authority over determining how it's distributed if it's manufactured in the UK? I
don't think we've got to that point yet. But I think given that given that the government has put a lot of money into the funding of this project, you know, I imagine there's an understanding that's been put in place about what happens next. I don't know the detail of that.
So part of that is still to be determined.
Yeah.
Okay. And then kind of on the same theme that we've been talking about poor countries. So the UK has pledged to give the world access to vaccines along with among 20 countries. But just taking the Oxford coronavirus vaccine as an example, it's still months away at best, and already 2 of the world's wealthiest countries have gained early access. So the UK gets first access, and then just announced yesterday, the US is paying up to $1.2 billion for doses that they could have as early as October. So it looks so far like the way to get a vaccine is by having a lot of money or having a connection to a big research institution. Realistically, how and when do you think we could get vaccines to the developing world?
So I think one of the important points as we move to the next stage, and all the important things we need to do, is to make sure we have the manufacturing capacity. So, you know, if you can manufacture this in vast quantities, then that increases the number of people who will have access to it. The second thing I think is making sure that when we've done that manufacturing and we have the doses, that the countries where it's going to be needed, which is basically every single country in the world, has the infrastructure necessary to deliver those vaccines. I think that Gavi has already done amazing work in that perspective with, I think it's the 68 poorest countries in the world. So I think that there needs to be a concerted effort amongst all the contributors to Gavi, which is why the pledging conference is so important, to make sure that that money is properly invested in both developing and manufacturing the vaccine, but then subsequently in making sure that the countries that need it have the infrastructure that they need to conduct the sort of programs and monitoring and all that stuff, which you know, in vulnerable countries with less highly developed health systems than ours, it's some of that basic infrastructure which is a bigger problem actually than access to the vaccine.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, not just on the Oxford vaccine, but also in all the vaccines being developed, the private sector globally is going to have a lot of power over how these vaccines are distributed. What kind of means do you think that governments, including the UK government, will be able to take to influence the private sector in its distribution around the world?
One of the things I think is fantastic about the is Gavi, for example, and the way in which we're approaching this is that it's a partnership approach. So it's not the private sector off doing its thing, governments doing their thing, academia doing their thing. It's very much a three-pronged approach, and I think it has to be like that because you know, the initial impetus for the funding for this has come from the British government. I mean, Oxford was doing fantastic work anyway, but their ability to ramp up and do this much more quickly has been done on the basis of government funding. So I think we have to see ourselves as working together. And I think that, you know, governments can help provide incentives for companies to set up manufacturing plants. So wherever those might be needed. So that's something which government can very effectively do to help the private sector. So I think it's more about incentivizing than it is about punishing or, you know, wielding a big stick. But I'm pretty certain that most companies, whoever they are, I mean, they're in it to make money, obviously, but they also want to do the right thing. And I think that certainly we've seen that from the British pharmaceutical companies who've been involved in this so far.
And just following up on that, are there certain incentives that you think would work for this private sector? What kind of incentives might governments be able to?
Well, I think the sort of the partnerships with major research institutions is really big for them. So, you know, making sure that they have access to this top quality, cutting edge research and helping to cement those partnerships is absolutely crucial because all companies want to discover the next big thing. And whether it's a vaccine for coronavirus or you know, a big cancer drug or whatever it is, I think all those things depend on access to the sort of world-beating research that's going on at Oxford or Imperial or Cambridge or wherever else it is. And that's a very effective role, I think, for government.
So, fourth and final question is when it comes to vaccinating the world, need to create priorities, whether that's priorities for a specific country or demographics. When the UK goes into these conferences and argues for how this should be done, what priorities will the UK be pushing for?
So I think the number one priority will be to make sure that everybody who needs access to it can get access to it. I think there are countries which on their own would be probably unable, either financially or in terms of the infrastructure, to get access. So I think our number one priority will be to make sure that those sorts of barriers to universal vaccination, which is basically what we're talking about here, are overcome. Because I think there are, you know, it's very easy to overlook certain countries or certain parts of the world, or to focus on one part of the world at the exclusion of others. But, you know, we've seen in the last few months that this is a completely indiscriminatory or undiscriminatory, non-discriminating virus, and it can attack anywhere at any time. And unless we can eradicate it everywhere, then none of us is safe. So I think that's, you know, access for everybody straight away. And then, you know, and then within that, there are obviously more vulnerable sectors of society. And you need to make sure, for example, that in Africa or wherever else it is, you know, that particularly women and girls, but not just women and girls, but women and girls generally have that access. Because I think, you know, in some societies, it's more difficult for women to go to healthcare centres. you know, they might be kept at home, or, you know, or they might have carers, whatever it is. So I think making sure that those sorts of otherwise discriminated against parts of the population in certain places, not everywhere, but in certain places, get access will be really important too.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
The pleasure. It was really nice to talk to you. And then perhaps if I ever get to England again, I could come see you in Oxford.
Yeah, that would be great.